The clock on the diner wall read 11 at night when the glass door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and a laugh that made Maeve Sullivan, the 27-year-old waitress with auburn hair tied back in a hurry and tired gray eyes, nearly drop the coffee tray from her calloused hands. The man who'd just walked in was Desmond, her husband, and beside him stood Corinne, her closest friend from the years she'd spent as an orphan, passed from one foster home to another. They sat right down in her section, and neither one recognized the waitress in the lowered cap as Desmond's wife. She stood frozen behind the counter, forced to listen as he bragged that he'd quietly signed the apartment over to himself, closed their joint account, and taken every cent she'd saved over 3 years to finish nursing school. Maeve gripped her order pad, carried 2 cups of coffee to the people who'd betrayed her, and set them down without her hands shaking at all, because some things burn to ash before you ever catch the scent of smoke. She didn't know that just a few hours later, in the worst storm of the season, while making a late food delivery past the old harbor, she'd hear a deafening blast, see a human hand reaching out from beneath a heap of shattered concrete, and be the only one who'd run toward it while everyone else ran away. She didn't know that the man she'd pull back from death, the tall man with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes as cold as steel, was Rhodes Callahan, 34 years old, the most powerful crime boss this city only dared to mention in a whisper. And she could never have guessed that her selfless act on that rainy night would light a single ember from the ashes of her life. An ember no force on earth, not even the ones who'd trampled her, could ever put out. If you believe kindness still has the power to change a whole destiny, hit that like button to support this story. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a little more hope, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The diner closed at nearly 1 in the morning, and when Maeve stepped out into the empty parking lot, the first rain of the season had begun to fall heavily on her shoulders. The memory of that unfaithful couple from earlier that evening still lingered, leaving a bitter taste as cold as the 2 untouched cups of coffee on table number 4, as if even their fake generosity was something they could not spare for her. Knowing that her shift at the diner was over but her financial struggles were far from fixed, she had driven straight back to her small, damp, rented room, carrying the heavy weight of the evening's betrayal. She knew she could only rest for a brief moment. Having secretly signed up for a late-night delivery service days prior, she still had one final, urgent order to fulfill before the night ended. On the table, lying still among the pile of unpaid bills, was the cream-colored envelope the mailman had left that afternoon, which was printed with the name of a law office she had never heard of. Maeve picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but because she knew what was inside even before she tore it open. Divorce papers, cold-typed lines, Desmond's signature already filled in with a firm stroke of ink, and a small note tucked inside with only one sentence, saying all she needed to do was sign, and everything would end smoothly. Smoothly. A small laugh broke from her, dry and hollow, out of place in the empty room. To him, ending a 3-year marriage was as easy as canceling an expired lease. She set the papers down, looked out the misted window, and in that moment, memories rushed back like a wave she had no time to brace against. She remembered being a child sitting on the front steps of one foster home after another, clutching a cloth bag that held everything she owned, learning never to cry in front of strangers because tears never made anyone stay longer. She remembered the day she met Desmond, a man who knew how to speak sweetly about the future, about a real home, and she had believed him, had given away everything she had, including the dream of returning to nursing school that she had been forced to put aside halfway through because she did not have enough money. For those 3 years, she had done everything. Waited tables on the night shift, taken extra cleaning work during the day, saved every dollar for the day she could wear a white nursing coat again, only to learn tonight that all that money had been taken away, cleanly and quietly, without a single question asked. She wondered whether she was stupid for still being surprised, because deep down she had felt his distance for months, only she had not wanted to believe it, had not wanted to admit that the only person she called family was slowly vanishing right in front of her. But Maeve did not cry, not even one tear. She had run out of tears long ago, and she understood that tears were a luxury someone like her had no right to let wash her away. She stood, hung her uniform on the hook to dry, then took from the drawer the only pen that still had ink. She sat down before the papers, placed the tip of the pen on the empty line, and for a moment she paused, not because of regret, but because something inside her had hardened, quietly and stubbornly, like roots forcing their way through stone. She would sign, Not because he wanted her to, but because she wanted to be free from the life that had once made her believe her worth was something other people could decide. Carefully, she wrote her name, letter by letter, then folded the papers and set them aside, drew a deep breath, and looked around the tiny room that was now everything she had. Empty-handed. But I still have these hands, she told herself, and tomorrow she would still have to wake up early, because there was one small living soul depending on her, one reason she would not allow herself to fall apart, not even for one night. The next morning, Maeve woke before the sky had fully brightened, and the first thing she did after washing her face with icy water was tap softly on the door of the room at the end of the hallway, where little Felix lived with his frail, aging grandmother. The 6-year-old boy opened the door with his hair tousled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. But the moment he saw her, that small face lit up as though she were the only good thing he looked forward to each day. Felix was not her child, not a blood relative, only a neighbor's child whom fate had treated no more gently than it had treated her. His mother had died when he was too young to remember her face, and his grandmother drifted in and out of clarity, her hands trembling so badly she could no longer cook herself a proper meal. From the day Maeve moved into this row of rented rooms, she had quietly taken on a responsibility no one had asked of her. Every morning she stopped by to make porridge. Every afternoon she taught him how to spell, and every night before going to work, she always left a still warm meal box on his windowsill. She stepped inside, straightened the thin blanket, poured the old woman a glass of water, then sat down beside Felix and took from her pocket a red apple a customer had left behind on a table the night before. The boy let out a soft little cheer, broke the apple in half, and pushed one half into her hand, saying Miss Maeve had to eat because she was too skinny, and that innocent sentence tightened her throat for a moment, because it had been so long since anyone had worried about her, instead of taking something from her. She stroked his hair, smiled, took a bite of the apple to ease his mind, and in that ordinary moment, she suddenly understood why she had not fallen apart the night before, why she still had a reason to wake up every morning. Someone like her could be empty-handed, could be betrayed, could be stripped of both a home and a dream. But as long as these small eyes still looked at her with absolute trust, she still had one thing no one could steal, the right to be a decent person. But kindness could not feed two mouths, and Maeve understood that very clearly when she sat down and counted the little money left in her worn wallet, a number that made her heart tighten. Rent was nearly due. Felix's grandmother's medicine was almost gone, and winter was coming close with long, freezing nights when she did not even have a proper coat to put on the boy. She could not count on Desmond, not one penny, never again, and she was not the kind of person who begged for anyone's pity. That final order of the night, which she had accepted right after closing the diner, was a route that ran deep into the night across empty roads few people wanted to take. The manager looked at her with concern and asked if she was sure about a young woman driving alone in the middle of the night. But Maeve only nodded, tightened her grip on the strap of the insulated bag, and said she was not afraid of hard work. She was only afraid that tomorrow she would have nothing to place in the hands of a hungry child. Just as night fully settled, the storm the sky had warned of came crashing down over the city, rain striking the windshield of Maeve's old car in dense waves until the wipers were almost useless, and she had to lean forward, narrowing her eyes to make out the road slick with yellow light. This route took her toward the old harbor district, a stretch of abandoned warehouses at the far edge of the city, empty even by daylight and colder still at night, a place other delivery drivers all shook their heads and refused, because the road was dark and there was not a single soul in sight. Maeve tightened her grip on the steering wheel, telling herself she only had to finish this delivery, and then she could go home to Felix. But just as the car turned past the row of warehouses, a terrible sound tore through the rain, a deep, muffled explosion rising from the ground along with the crack of breaking concrete. And right before her eyes, one corner of the old warehouse shuddered and collapsed in a cloud of dust that mingled with the pouring rain. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding, and through the headlights she saw several shadowy figures scatter in panic from the darkness, running toward cars parked farther away before the engines roared and vanished into the night, leaving the ruined scene behind as if no one had ever been there. Maeve should have left too. She should have turned the car around and gotten away from that place as fast as anyone with any sense of fear would have done. But then, among the rain-slick wreckage, she saw it, a human hand protruding from beneath a broken slab of concrete, the fingers moving faintly and weakly, as if trying to hold on to the last thread of life. She had no time to think. The instinct of someone who had once trained to heal rose up stronger than fear, and she rushed out of the car into the pounding rain and dropped to her knees beside the man buried under the wreckage, her 2 hands beginning to clear away pieces of shattered brick, bent lengths of metal, and chunks of debris. Ignoring the burning sting in her palms and the mud clinging to her skin, she called out, asking if he could hear her voice trembling but firm, and when she finally managed to pull his upper body free from the rubble, she quickly checked his breathing, pressing her ear to his chest to listen to the heartbeat that was growing weaker. The man was tall, his face smeared with mud and darkened in the shadows, one arm badly injured and bleeding without stopping. And Maeve understood that if she did not stop the bleeding at once, he would not last until help arrived. She did not hesitate. She tore off her scarf, folded it into thick layers, and pressed it hard against the wound on his arm, using the weight of her whole body to bear down and slow the flow of blood, her mouth never stopping as she reassured him, telling him to hold on, telling him she would not leave him alone. The man opened his eyes slightly in his daze, and through the rain he saw a woman's face bent close over him, gray eyes shining with a strange steadiness in the middle of panic. Then his remaining hand weakly closed around her wrist, as if he wanted to remember something before sinking back into unconsciousness. Maeve kept one hand pressed to the wound, while the other shook as she grabbed her phone and called for an ambulance, shouting the address of the Old Harbor District into the speaker over the roar of the rain, and she stayed there through those long, endless minutes, kneeling in freezing water, stubbornly holding the blood-soaked scarf in place for a complete stranger, whose name she did not even know. Only when the green and red lights of the ambulance flashed did Maeve finally step back, soaked through and trembling from the cold. She left no name, quietly returned to her car, and drove back to her rented room as dawn began to break. Dropping onto her bed with bleeding, scratched hands, her eyes caught the signed divorce papers resting on the table. The painful chapter with Desmond was officially over, and looking at her bleeding palms, she knew that despite the exhaustion, she had survived the worst storm of her life. Rhodes Callahan woke in a private room on the highest floor of a private hospital, where the lights had been softened, and 2 men in suits stood silently on guard in the hallway, and the first thing he felt was not the dull ache in the arm that had been carefully bandaged, but an image that kept drifting through his mind from the haze of unconsciousness. A pair of gray eyes bent close over him in the rain, steady and without a trace of fear. He frowned and tried to sit up, and at once August, a man around 40 with a severe face who had followed him for more than 10 years, hurried forward to support his shoulders, his deep voice heavy with worry as he said Rhodes had been asleep for nearly 2 days, that the doctor said if the wound had not been stopped from bleeding in time right there at the scene, things would have turned out very differently. Rhodes fell silent when he heard those words, because they confirmed what he had dimly sensed, that his life had been held in place not by his own men, but by some stranger's hand in the night. He asked August what had truly happened at the harbor, and the face of his trusted associate immediately hardened as he lowered his voice, and explained that the warehouse collapse that night had not been an accident, that their people had searched the scene and found traces of carefully planned sabotage, that the structure had been weakened beforehand, and the timing of the strike matched exactly with the moment Rhodes arrived there to inspect a shipment. August said plainly that this was a move by the rival gang that had long been eyeing their harbor territory, an underground force that wanted to remove him from its path by staging an accident that would leave no trace, and if not for that woman, the scheme would have succeeded completely. As Rhodes listened, his eyes slowly grew cold, his hands tightening over the white blanket. But what troubled him at that moment was not the enemy in the dark, but the person who had risked herself to pull him from the wreckage and then quietly disappeared without leaving even a name. He was a man who had lived his whole life by one principle. A debt of blood was repaid with blood, and a debt of grace was repaid with grace, never allowing anyone to suffer a loss because of him, whether for evil or for good. And the thought that someone had saved his life and then walked away asking for nothing stirred in him a strange feeling he had not known for a very long time. In Rhodes's world, no one did anything without calculation. Every favor carried a price, and every smile hid a blade. Yet that woman had knelt in the cold rain, holding pressure against the wound of a stranger, then vanished, waiting for no money, no thanks, as though saving a human life were the most natural thing in the world. He turned to August, his voice hoarse but firm in every word, and ordered him to find that woman, the one with gray eyes who had used a scarf to stop his bleeding in the storm. August hesitated briefly, gently reminding him that finding a nameless woman in the middle of an entire city would not be easy, especially when they were also having to focus their strength on the enemy that had just revealed itself. But Rhodes only looked at him with eyes that allowed no argument, and said enemies would always be there. But a debt of gratitude was something he would never leave hanging in the air. He demanded every traffic camera image around the harbor from that night, ordered them to trace every car that had left the scene, and told them to uncover the identity of the woman who had become a quiet obsession in his mind, never knowing that when he found her, he would discover his savior was the most destitute and lonely person in the vast city. It took nearly 2 weeks for the blurred images from traffic cameras to lead Rhodes's men to the old car, and from that car to a name, Maeve Sullivan, a waitress working the night shift at a small diner off the highway. And instead of having someone bring gifts to her as August suggested, Rhodes did something that surprised even his closest associate. He went there himself. Late one evening, when the diner had nearly emptied, the glass door swung open, and a tall man stepped inside, wearing an expensive dark coat, his stride calm, but carrying a kind of authority that seemed to make the very air grow heavy. And he chose a table in the shadowed corner, where he could see the entire room. Maeve walked over with her familiar order pad, completely unaware that the man sitting before her was the very one she had pulled from the wreckage that night, because that night had been pitch dark, his face covered in mud and blood. And now, before her, there was only a strange gentleman, with a clean face and deep, unreadable eyes. She asked what he would like in her polite working voice, and Rhodes lifted his gaze to meet hers. Those same gray eyes, the eyes that had haunted him through all his days in the hospital, and for a moment, he almost forgot what he had meant to say. He ordered a cup of black coffee, no sugar, then quietly watched her move among the empty tables, noticing the way she lightly rubbed the palm of her hand, where the scratches had not fully healed, the way she paused by the window to look into the night with a weariness she tried to hide behind a courteous smile. When she brought the coffee over, he spoke, his voice low and slow, asking whether she often worked the late shift alone like this, and Maeve looked briefly surprised by such a question from a stranger, but she still answered that she worked any shift she could, because she needed the money and she wasn't afraid of hard work. Rhodes pressed one more question, asking whether a city like this was kind to people who worked as hard as she did, and this time Maeve gave a small laugh, not bitter, only tired, then replied that the city did not owe anyone kindness. People had to be kind to one another on their own, because if she waited for life to treat her fairly, she might be waiting until she was old. That answer left Rhodes silent, because it sounded exactly like what he had sensed in her that rainy night. A person who gave without expecting anything back, and he looked at her longer than an ordinary customer should have, long enough that Maeve grew a little uneasy and stepped back, saying that if he needed anything else, he could call her. He asked nothing more, only slowly finished his cup of coffee, while his eyes still followed her. And when he rose and put on his coat to leave, he placed a folded bill on the table and walked out without waiting for change. Only when Maeve cleared the table did she pick up the bill and freeze, because the amount was many times the price of 1 cup of coffee, enough to cover her room rent for an entire month, a tip so absurdly large that she had never received anything like it in all her years of waiting tables. She hurried to the door and looked around the dark parking lot, hoping to return it to the customer, but he was already gone, with only the tail lights of a luxury car quietly disappearing around the bend. Maeve stood still beneath the diner awning, the money clenched in her hand, a strange confusion rising inside her along with a trace of caution, wondering who that mysterious man was, why he had looked at her with such an unusual gaze, and why a stranger would be so generous to her, never imagining that the man who had just left was the one whose life she had saved, and that the thread of fate between them had only just begun to be tied again. That evening, when Rhodes returned to the mansion behind its heavy iron gates, August was already waiting in the study with a face that could not hide his unease, and as soon as the door closed, he spoke, his voice still carrying the respect of a subordinate, but every word heavy with worry, saying that his boss personally going to a roadside diner to meet an unfamiliar woman was something he could not feel easy about. August reminded Rhodes that they were in the most dangerous moment they had faced in many years, that the enemy had already struck once, and would certainly strike again, that every move Rhodes made now was being watched, and that if it became known there was a woman who concerned him so deeply, it would be no different from placing a target on her back with his own hands and exposing a fatal weakness in himself. His trusted associate said plainly that in their world, affection was the most dangerous luxury of all, that anyone Rhodes cared about could become a hostage in an enemy's hands, and that the best way to repay that woman was to send her a generous sum of money through an intermediary, and then stay away from her forever, so she could live peacefully outside this deadly whirlpool. Rhodes quietly poured himself a glass of whiskey, stood beside the tall window looking out over the dark courtyard, and only after a long while did he turn back and say that he understood everything August feared, understood better than anyone the price of letting a human being step into his world. But there were debts that could not be repaid with an envelope of money passed through someone else's hands. August did not back down. He stepped forward, his voice almost pleading, asking whether a waitress was worth risking the safety of the entire organization. And that question made Rhodes turn sharply, his eyes cold and keen, demanding that August tell him everything they had found out about her, without hiding a single detail. August sighed, knowing he could not stop his boss once he had made up his mind, then opened the thin file on the desk and began to report that the woman named Maeve Sullivan had grown up without a father or mother. An orphan child passed from one foster home to another until she was old enough to fend for herself. August went on to say that she had once studied nursing but had been forced to stop because she could not afford the tuition, that she had married a real estate broker named Desmond Hale, and that this man, together with his new mistress, was the one who had driven her to the edge. August's voice lowered as he reached the final lines, explaining how Desmond had completely stripped her of their home and all her nursing school savings. He left her entirely empty-handed, living in a damp, rented room and working 2 or 3 jobs at once just to survive. But the detail that made August pause the longest, the detail even he could not help feeling moved by, was the last one in the file, that in the midst of her own worst hardship, this woman was still quietly taking care of a 6-year-old orphan boy next door, and his frail grandmother, cooking for them, buying medicine, and looking after them with the little money she earned on dangerous delivery nights. When Rhodes heard that, he set the glass down, and the whole room sank into silence. And for the first time in many years, something difficult to name passed across his steel-cold face, half sorrow and half reverence. Slowly, almost as if speaking to himself, he said that she had nothing left in her hands, and yet she had still saved a stranger in the rain and walked away asking for nothing, still shared her last bite of food with a child who was not her blood, while so many people who had everything were willing to step on others just to have more. August watched his boss in silence, no longer daring to advise him against it, because he realized that what he saw in Rhodes's eyes was no longer merely the concern of a man who wanted to repay a debt, but something deeper quietly taking root, and he understood that no matter how worried he was, nothing would stop this powerful man from finding a way to step into the life of the woman who had wrested him back from death. A few nights later, that strange man appeared at the diner again at the familiar late hour, still at the table in the shadowed corner, still with a cup of black coffee without sugar, and this time Maeve brought it to him with a trace of caution still lingering from the impossibly large tip he had left the other night, intending to find a way to return the extra money to him. When she set the cup down on the table, he reached out to take it, and in that very moment, the diner's yellow light fell across his forearm, revealing a wound beginning to heal, a long mark running down his arm in exactly the place Maeve's hand remembered with painful clarity, because it was the very spot where she had pressed her scarf for nearly an hour in the rain to hold back the blood flowing from him. She froze, the coffee cup trembling slightly in her hand, and the memory of that stormy night rushed back with brutal force. The collapsed concrete, the weak hand reaching out through the rain, the mud-smeared face she had bent over while whispering reassurance, and she lifted her eyes to stare straight into his, unable to hide her shock, blurting out that it was him, the man from the harbor that night. Rhodes did not look away from her gaze. He slowly set the coffee cup down, and in the long silence between them, he gave a small nod, admitting that yes, he was the man she had pulled from the wreckage, the man who would not be sitting here now if not for her. Maeve stepped back, one hand gripping the back of a chair, her heart tangled in too many feelings at once. She asked why he had come here, why he had not said anything from the beginning, and had only watched her in silence like that. And her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the feeling of being surrounded by something beyond her understanding. Rhodes looked at her for a long moment, then spoke in a low voice that was unusually honest, saying he had come looking for her because in his entire life, he had never met anyone who saved a stranger, and then walked away without waiting for a thank you or a single dollar in return. And he needed to know who that woman was, needed to see with his own eyes whether what she had done that night was real. or only the illusion of a man standing at the edge of death? Maeve lowered her head slightly and said she had not done anything great, that anyone with a conscience would have done the same. But Rhodes slowly shook his head and answered no. Most people would have turned their cars around and fled, just like the people who scattered that night. Very few would kneel down in freezing water to keep alive someone they had never known. And it was that rare thing that made it impossible for him to forget her. There was something in his calm, deep voice, in those fathomless eyes that seemed cold, yet hid a loneliness so much like her own, that gradually softened Maeve, and she pulled out a chair and sat across from him in the empty diner, where only the two of them remained. For the first time, she did not speak to him in the professional tone of a waitress, but like one human being talking to another. They spoke of simple things, of long, lonely nights, of the feeling of having the whole world turn its back on you, and still having to force yourself to rise every morning. And Maeve realized that although this man clearly belonged to a world entirely different from hers, wealthy and filled with authority, somewhere deep inside him he carried a wound that had never healed, a loneliness money could not cover. She did not ask his last name, and he did not rush to give it. He only introduced himself briefly, saying she could call him Rhodes, and he did not reveal who he truly was or what work he did, only letting the conversation drift naturally, as though two lost souls had accidentally found a little warmth in each other in the cold, late night. When he stood to leave, this time he did not leave behind any absurdly large tip, but only paid the exact price of the coffee with a sincere thank you. And before stepping out the door, he turned back and said softly that he owed her a life, a debt he would surely repay, leaving Maeve standing still in the middle of the diner with her heart, for the first time in a very long while, beating with a strange new rhythm she did not yet know how to name. The thought of that life debt drove Rhodes back to the diner on another evening. But this time, he did not come to watch in silence. He came to say plainly what he wanted. And when the diner had thinned out, he asked Maeve to sit across from him, then placed a thick envelope on the table, along with several documents he had already prepared. In his familiar, calm voice, he told her he was a man who never left a debt hanging in the air, that she had saved his life, and now it was his turn to repay her properly. And inside that envelope was enough money for her not to worry about money for many years, enough for her to leave that damp rented room, enough for her to return to school and earn the nursing degree she had always dreamed of. He added that if she wanted, he could arrange a decent job for her, a proper apartment, a life she deserved after everything she had endured, and that all she had to do was nod, and every hardship in her life would disappear that very night. Maeve sat silently, looking at the envelope in front of her, and for a moment, the woman inside her, who had been worn down by money, nearly wavered, because that sum could change everything, could buy medicine for Felix's grandmother, could buy the boy a warm coat for the coming winter, could give back to Maeve the future Desmond had stolen from her. But then she lifted her eyes, and instead of taking the envelope, she gently pushed it back toward him, her gray gaze strangely steady, and said she truly appreciated his kindness, but she couldn't accept it. Rhodes frowned slightly, for the first time in his life facing someone who refused his money, and he asked why. Wasn't she in desperate need of it? Wasn't this the very thing that could solve every problem she had? Maeve smiled faintly, a sad smile but one filled with dignity, and answered that yes, she was poor, she was struggling, she was fighting for every dollar, but on the night she knelt down and held pressure against his wound, she had not been thinking of being paid, and if she accepted that money now, then what she had done would turn into nothing more than a transaction, and she would be no different from the people who had once treated her like something that could be bought and traded. She went on, her voice slow, every word seeming to carve itself into the stillness, saying that all her life people had put a price on her, had seen her as a child no one wanted to take in, had been treated by her husband like a piece of property that could be thrown away when it was no longer useful, and the only thing no one had yet stolen from her was her right to self-respect, her right to do something decent without selling it for money. She said that if he truly wanted to thank her, then he should respect that, should let her keep the only human part of herself that still remained whole, because once she traded that away, she would have nothing left to be proud of. Rhodes sat motionless for a long time, the envelope of money lying between them like an invisible boundary, and for the first time after so many years of living in a world where everything had a price and every person could be bought, he felt something stir deep inside him. Before him was a woman with nothing in her hands, a woman who should have seized the rare chance fate had given her to change her life, and yet she refused it only to keep her dignity and that refusal made him look at her with an entirely different gaze, no longer as a savior who needed to be repaid, but as a person he truly respected. Slowly, he took back the envelope, nodded, and said he was sorry for hurting her, that he was used to treating people in the only way he knew how, and that this was the first time someone had made him understand that some things in this world could not, and should not, be repaid with money. When he rose to leave, a respect he had never before felt for another human being had begun to glow inside that powerful man, and he told himself that if he could not repay her with money, then he would find another way, one worthy of the very dignity she had just allowed him to witness. A few nights after the refusal at the diner, just as Maeve had finished a late delivery and returned to the rooming house in the cold of early winter, she heard Felix's grandmother calling for her in panic from the end of the hallway, and a bad feeling made her drop the delivery bag and run. Little Felix was lying on the bed with his face flushed red, his breathing heavy, and his forehead burning beneath her hand. The fever had climbed high while the trembling old woman had not known what to do, and Maeve understood that she was not allowed to panic, not even for 1 second. The nursing knowledge she had once studied but never finished suddenly came back to her clearly, and she calmly told the old woman to bring her a basin of warm water and several clean towels, then removed some of the boy's thick layers, wiped his body with warm water to lower the fever gradually, checked his breathing, and watched every sign carefully, just as she had been taught. She did not give him medicine carelessly, but patiently monitored him, cooling him while murmuring gentle words to comfort him, calling his name softly, and telling him she was there now, that he was going to be all right, and it was that warm voice that made the boy settle a little, his tired eyes following her as though he had found his only place to lean in the middle of his misery. When she realized his fever was too high and was not dropping as quickly as she wanted, Maeve decided she could not wait any longer. She lifted him into her arms, wrapped him carefully in a blanket, and called a car to take all 3 of them to the nearest hospital in the middle of the night, her heart tight with worry but her hands still steady, not trembling at all. In the emergency room, the doctors took him in and reassured her that because she had handled the fever correctly from the very beginning, the situation was not dangerous, that it was only an ordinary viral fever children often got, and he would recover after enough rest and proper care. Maeve let out a breath of relief and sank onto a chair in the hallway, feeling as though a stone had been lifted from her chest. But then another fear rose when she thought of the hospital bill and the medicine she had no idea how to pay for, because the little money in her pocket was not even enough to get through the coming days. Yet when she walked to the payment counter with a tense face, ready to ask whether she could pay in installments, the clerk looked at her and said every cost for the boy had already been paid in full by a benefactor, someone who had left no name and had only instructed them to take very good care of the child. Maeve froze, and the calm face and deep eyes of the man named Rhodes immediately appeared in her mind, because she knew there was no one else in the world who cared about her and Felix that much, and she could not help feeling confused, caught between gratitude and a strange kind of guilt. The next morning, after Felix's fever had broken and he was alert again, asking for porridge and smiling and talking like himself, Maeve texted Rhodes to ask him directly, and he did not deny it. He only answered briefly that he knew she would not accept money for herself, but he believed she would not have the heart to refuse help for a sick child. That reply softened something inside Maeve, because he had understood her so well, understood that she could refuse anything meant only for herself, but would never place her pride above Felix's health, and this time he had helped quietly, without display, without making her feel pitied or bought. A few days later, Rhodes stopped by to visit after Felix had fully recovered, and what surprised Maeve was that this cold, powerful man seemed almost endearingly awkward in front of the boy. He sat down at Felix's eye level, asked him a few questions, and quietly smiled as Felix innocently showed him his crooked drawings. Watching that scene, watching the tall man bend down and patiently listen to a child, Maeve felt something warm inside her chest, and for the first time after so many lonely months, among 3 people who shared no blood at all, there began to bloom a closeness and peace, so strange and gentle, a small green shoot opening from the very soil of her life that she had thought had long since gone dry. That small green shoot of feeling that had just begun to open suddenly received an unexpected spark a few days later, when Maeve received an official call from the local authorities regarding the ongoing investigation into her ex-husband. The officer cheerfully informed her that a high-profile legal team, secretly assigned by a mysterious corporate entity, had fast-tracked her case, successfully freezing Desmond's assets and recovering every single dollar of the nursing school savings he had stolen from her. She did not need to guess any further. There was only one person with the immense influence required to move the gears of justice so quickly on her behalf. Rhodes's name rose in her mind, not with the simple gratitude she had felt over Felix's hospital bill, but with a complex wave of emotion that surprised even her. She went to see him that very evening, her voice trembling with a mixture of pride and vulnerability, demanding to know why he had secretly interfered in her personal legal matters without her consent. Rhodes looked briefly stunned, then explained that he had only wanted to ensure justice was served swiftly, so she could reclaim her stolen life. But Maeve shook her head, cutting him off with a sentence that made the room fall silent, saying the problem was not the outcome, but the fact that he had decided for her behind her back, as if her own wishes carried no weight at all. She went on, each word catching in her throat, saying that all her life she had lived in a world where other people kept arranging her fate without ever asking what she wanted. Foster parents deciding when to give her back, her husband deciding to take everything she had without one word of discussion, and now even him, the only person she had thought might truly respect her, had silently determined the course of her life behind her back, just like the others. She said what she needed from him was not a benefactor standing above her and granting kindness from on high, but someone who saw her as an equal, someone respectful enough to ask before touching her life, because otherwise the distance between them would forever remain the distance between giver and receiver, and never become the distance between two human beings who were truly equal. Rhodes went still before those words, and for the first time in his life, the man who was used to giving orders and arranging everything according to his will realized that his good will, no matter how sincere, had accidentally repeated the very wound she had carried all her life. He did not offer one more excuse. He only slowly stood to face her, and in those eyes that were usually cold as steel, there was now a rare and genuine remorse. He said he was sorry, that he had been wrong, not because he had helped her, but because he had not asked her first, because he had forgotten that respecting a person meant respecting their right to choose. He promised her that from now on, he would never again decide anything concerning her behind her back, that if she wanted, he would withdraw the tuition payment so she could handle it herself when she was ready, and that he would rather lose the chance to help her than lose the trust she had struggled so hard to give him. That simple and honest apology softened the anger in Maeve's heart. She looked at him for a long time, then gave a small nod, and though the little crack that had just appeared in their trust could not heal immediately, they both understood without saying it that they had just crossed an important test together, learning how to move toward each other not as a benefactor and someone indebted to him, but as two people slowly finding their way toward true equality and understanding. News that a wealthy and mysterious man had been regularly visiting the diner to meet privately with the poor waitress soon spread through the small neighborhood, and it reached Desmond and Corinne at the very moment his real estate work was spiraling downward without breaks. His debts piled so high they kept him awake every night. When he heard whispers that the man drove a luxury car, dressed expensively, and was unusually generous with Maeve, greed immediately stirred inside Desmond, and he no longer saw his former wife as something discarded, but as a door that might lead to the money he was starving for. He came to the diner one afternoon, this time without Corinne beside him, his face arranged into a look of pained remorse he had carefully rehearsed, and when Maeve stepped out, he immediately spoke in a falsely gentle voice, saying he had thought a great deal, that he had realized what a terrible mistake he had made in losing her, that only after these days without her had he understood how important she was to him. Maeve stood still and listened, and what surprised even her was how strangely calm her heart felt, no longer shaking with pain as it had on the night she stood behind the counter listening to him boast about stealing every bit of her money, no longer holding even the faintest longing to cling to him, because the woman standing there now was no longer the silent, enduring Maeve of the past. Desmond mistook her silence for softening, so he pushed further, seizing the chance to complain about his debts and desperation, hinting in circles that if only she helped him through this difficult period, perhaps the two of them could start over, and that with the close relationship she now had with that wealthy benefactor, a small sum of money would hardly matter. At that, Maeve gave a small laugh, so calm it made Desmond uneasy, and she answered him, every word clear and firm, no longer carrying the old meekness, saying she understood him far too well now, and did not need him to perform such a clumsy play any longer. She said plainly that he did not regret losing her at all. He only regretted thinking that she had suddenly become useful, that on the day he secretly transferred the apartment into his own name and drained the money she had saved to return to school, He had personally torn up every right he had to come back and speak to her about starting over. Desmond froze, then tried to salvage things by lowering his voice and reproaching her, saying she had changed, that she had become cold and distant, but Maeve only looked straight into his eyes and said she had not changed. She had only finally learned how to see a person clearly, and that the only person she had owed an apology to all these years turned out to be herself, for letting herself believe in him for too long. She told him that the money from that benefactor, whether it existed or not, would never flow into the pocket of a man like him through her hands, because she would rather be poor and hold her head high than become a tool for someone else's greed one more time. That sharp reply left Desmond speechless, the false remorse on his face cracking to reveal the anger and confusion of a man who had just been seen through to the bottom, and he stammered a few vague threats that she would regret this, that she did not know who she was getting involved with, before turning away in frustration and leaving. Maeve watched the man who had once been her husband disappear beyond the glass door, and this time there was no lingering attachment or pain left inside her, only the peaceful relief of someone who had officially closed an old, dark chapter of her life, though she had no idea that Desmond's careless threat was not entirely empty, and that the dark ties he had become tangled in were about to collide with the secret world of the man who had stepped into her life. The truth Maeve had not yet been able to foresee came crashing down on what seemed like an ordinary morning, while she was sitting in the diner waiting for her shift to begin, and happened to look up at the old television hanging on the wall, where the local news was airing a report that left her frozen. On the screen was a face familiar enough to make her heart ache, the calm face and deep eyes of the man named Rhodes, with the caption beneath it identifying him by his full name, Rhodes Callahan, chairman of Callahan Freight, while the anchor's even voice reported that authorities were expanding an investigation into the company on suspicion of connections to a series of underground operations controlling the region's seaports and transport route. The report mentioned gangland killings, murky deals, and described Callahan as a force the authorities had been unable to touch for many years, a name people in this city only dared speak in a cautious whisper. The cup of coffee in Maeve's hand tilted slightly, and a few hot drops spilled over and burned the back of her hand, though she hardly felt it, because her entire mind was spinning in a wordless shock. The man who had quietly paid the hospital bill to save Felix, the man who had bent down patiently to listen as a child showed him drawings, the only man in all these years who had looked at her with respect and equality, turned out to be a boss of the underworld, a world of violence and darkness that she had feared and avoided all her life. She stepped into the back of the diner, leaned against the cold wall, and let her thoughts tear at her, because her heart and her reason were pulling her in two completely opposite directions. One part of her cried out that she had to stay away from that man immediately, that an orphan who had suffered enough wounds like her could not step into a world where human life could be taken after a single explosion in the night, just like the night she had met him, that she still had Felix to protect, a fragile child who could not be dragged into that deadly whirlpool. But another part of her whispered through the ache that the man on the news, no matter how frightening the title attached to him might be, was still the man who had sincerely apologized when he realized he was wrong, still the only one who had respected her dignity instead of trampling on it the way others had done, and that the person she had spoken with during those quiet late nights was nothing like the cold, ruthless image the news had painted. Maeve clenched both hands, painfully aware of the bitter contradiction of her fate, that the person who had been kindest to her had come from the darkest place, that the rare warm flame that had just begun to glow in her life had been lit inside a world where one wrong step could burn down everything she was trying to protect. She did not know what to believe, the man whose gentleness and sincerity she had seen with her own eyes, or the chilling warning of reason and of the whole world, and the confusion was so great it nearly stole her breath. In the end, fear won, at least in that moment, because for a woman with nothing but her own two hands and a child to protect, safety had to come before everything else, and Maeve decided to step back. She sent Rhodes a short message saying she needed time, that perhaps it would be best if they did not see each other anymore, then turned off her phone and held herself in the cold, rented room, trying to convince herself that retreat was the only right choice, never knowing that the events about to unfold would not allow her to quietly walk out of his life so easily. While Maeve was sinking into confusion and choosing to pull away, Rhodes, in his own mansion, was facing a discovery no less shocking, because the investigation he had assigned to August to track down those behind the sabotage at the harbor had finally revealed dark threads tangled together in a way no one could have expected. August entered the study with a thick file and a face more grave than ever, set it down on the desk before his boss, and said that their people had traced the entire network of small-time hands the rival gang had used to stage the warehouse collapse, and among those names was one that made even August freeze when he compared it with the old files. Rhodes opened the documents, and his eyes stopped on a name so familiar it sent a coldness down his spine. Desmond Hale, the real estate broker who was Maeve's ex-husband, the man who had driven her to the edge, the man Rhodes had read about in the file from the earliest days of learning about his savior. August explained that weeks before that fateful night at the harbor, Desmond had sunk deep into debt after failed business dealings, and to get money, he had turned to the very rival gang that stood against Rhodes, borrowing from loan sharks without knowing, or perhaps without caring, that he was stepping into a world far more dangerous than any numbers written on a debt paper. When he could no longer repay the debt that kept swelling day by day, Desmond had been squeezed by them and forced to become a petty errand man, using his cover as a broker and his business connections to spy, to provide information about the schedules and locations of people the gang had targeted. In exchange for more time to delay payment, August lowered his voice as he went on, saying that the very information Desmond had sold had helped the enemy learn Rhodes's schedule for inspecting the shipment at the harbor that night, the crucial detail that allowed them to calculate the timing so the warehouse structure would collapse exactly when he was there. Rhodes sat motionless before the truth, so cruelly ironic it felt almost merciless, because it meant that the wretched ex-husband who had ruined Maeve's life was also the man who had indirectly pushed Rhodes to the very edge of death, only for fate, in one strange turn, to make the discarded wife the one who knelt in the rain and wrested his life back. He mentally retraced the timeline with brutal clarity. Desmond's dealings with the underground gang had occurred weeks prior, entirely separate from his personal betrayal of Maeve. The treasonous information he sold had simply been stored by the rival gang until the perfect moment to strike, weaving a dark, invisible thread that directly connected Maeve's painful past to Rhodes's imminent danger. August carefully reminded him that this discovery made the situation far more complicated, because Desmond was now not only Maeve's painful past, but also a link in the plot against his own boss. And once the rival gang realized the connection between Rhodes and that woman, both Maeve and the child she was caring for could be dragged into danger. Rhodes stood and walked to the window, his eyes darkening, not with anger toward Desmond, but with deep concern for the woman who had just texted him, asking to step back from his life, because he understood that no matter how much she wanted to stay away from his world, the threads of fate had tied them together since that rainy night, and now she was standing on a dangerous line she did not yet even know existed. He turned to August, his voice low and resolute, ordering him to quietly assign people to protect Maeve and the boy from a distance, while also accelerating the hunt for the rival gang, because he knew he did not have much time left to keep the woman he valued safe. In the days that followed, Rhodes lived inside a struggle unlike anything his whole life of power had ever forced him to taste, because he knew very well why Maeve had sent that message, asking to step back, knew she had seen the news about who he truly was, and had chosen fear as any clear-minded person would have chosen. And the most painful part was that he could not blame her, not with a single word. He sat for hours in the quiet study, looking out over the dark courtyard, where people had always come and gone because of fear or self-interest. And for the first time, he asked himself what the world he had worked so hard to build, the power that made the entire city whisper his name with caution, had truly given him besides loneliness and enemies waiting in the dark. He thought of Maeve's steady gray eyes in the rain, thought of the way she had pushed the envelope of money back without the slightest tremble, thought of what she had said about the right to keep her dignity and the right to choose, and he realized that the woman with nothing in her hands was far freer than he was, because she lived true to herself, while he had traded his soul for things that now suddenly seemed meaningless. August noticed the change in his boss, and reminded him that this was not the time to be distracted by a woman when the enemy was tightening its circle more and more. But this time Rhodes only shook his head quietly and said something that stunned even August, that he was tired of a world that always forced him to suspect everyone, and never allowed him to keep anything clean. He said that on the night he was buried beneath the wreckage, when he had been close to death, the only person who reached out a hand to save him had not been his loyal men or powerful partners, but a stranger who owed him nothing, and that very moment had shown him exactly how much he was truly worth in the world he had once considered everything. From those thoughts, a great decision slowly took shape in Rhodes's heart. a decision he knew would demand a high and dangerous price: to leave the underworld behind, to withdraw step by step from its dark operations, to turn his empire toward a lawful path, even if that meant giving up much of his power and facing resistance from the very people who did not want him to walk away. August warned him anxiously that leaving this world would not be simple, that there were people who would rather see him fall than let him walk out in peace. But Rhodes's mind was firmly made up, his eyes lit with a kind of determination unlike his usual one, no longer the coldness of a crime boss, but the resolve of a man who wanted to live again. Yet he understood that even if he changed his whole life, he had no right to use that as pressure to pull Maeve back, because doing so would only repeat the mistake she had called him out for. And so he went to her not with a glittering promise or an expensive gift, but with the bare honesty of himself. He waited for her outside the diner one evening, and when Maeve stepped out with caution and confusion in her face, he did not move closer but kept a respectful distance, telling her that he knew she was afraid and that he did not blame her, that he had not come to persuade her to trade her safety or Felix's safety for him. He honestly told her about his decision to leave his old world behind, not to buy her trust, but because he himself wanted to live a different life, and he said that whether she chose to stay or walk away, his decision would not change, because she had shown him that a person could live decently even with nothing left, and he wanted to learn how to live that way. Maeve stood still and listened, her heart swaying between fear and an emotion she could not deny, because this was the first time a powerful man had placed the choice entirely in her hands, without attaching any condition or pressure to it. And though she could not answer him that night, his eyes and those sincere words planted in her heart a new seed of trust, a belief that perhaps people really could change if they were brave enough to choose again from the beginning. This fragile bond that had only just begun to warm Maeve's heart had no time to firmly take root before danger struck. Exactly as Rhodes had silently feared, because the rival gang, while watching him, had soon discovered the frequent presence of that woman in his life. And with the ruthless instinct of those who lived in darkness, they immediately realized she was the weakness they could exploit. Maeve herself had sensed that something was wrong over the past few days. Strange cars parked outside the rooming house longer than usual, the feeling that someone was watching whenever she made night deliveries, and with the sharp awareness of someone who had spent her whole life protecting herself, she decided to send Felix and his frail grandmother to stay with Mrs. Inez, the older co-worker at the diner whom she trusted, using the excuse that she had to work several long shifts and asking the woman to look after the boy for her. Because of that cautious decision, when disaster truly came, the child was in a completely safe place, far away from danger, knowing nothing, witnessing nothing that was threatening the woman who had taken him in, and that was the only thing that gave Maeve comfort on the terrifying night ahead. That night, just after she finished her final delivery and walked toward her car in the dark parking lot, two strange men suddenly blocked her way, their grim posture and cold eyes radiating threat and making her heart tighten. And one of them spoke in a hoarse voice, calling her by her exact name and saying they had been waiting for her for a long time. Maeve tried to stay calm, stepped back, and asked who they were and what they wanted from her. But the man only gave a faint laugh and said she had gotten involved with the wrong person, and now she would have to become the message they wanted to send to Rhodes Callahan. They did not touch her at once, but used threats to break her will, reciting the rented room where she lived, the diner where she worked, and even her night deliveries as if to prove she had been under their control for a long time, and that if she went with them obediently, no one would have to get hurt. In that moment of real danger, Maeve felt fear rise cold along her spine, but strangely, it did not make her collapse. Instead, it awakened in her a stubbornness forged through an entire life of struggle. She understood that the weaker she appeared, the more dangerous it would be, so she forced her voice not to tremble, and answered that she was nothing to that man, that they were badly mistaken if they thought they could use her to threaten anyone. As she spoke, she quietly watched everything around her, her mind moving fast the way it had always done when she had to calculate every dollar just to survive. Noticing the light of a convenience store still glowing in the distance, and a security camera mounted on a nearby utility pole, and she tried to stretch the conversation by pretending to cooperate, asking what they wanted her to do, buying time while gradually shifting toward the place with light and people. One of the men began to lose patience and moved closer, grabbing her arm to drag her away, but Maeve was ready. She suddenly swung the insulated delivery bag hard into his face, then tore herself free and ran toward the brightly lit store, shouting loudly to draw attention, because she knew that a public place and light were the best weapons of someone empty-handed against men who only knew how to act in darkness. Her scream and the headlights of a car just pulling in made the two men falter. They had not expected prey that seemed so weak to fight back with such fierce, quick thinking. And just as they were still hesitating, the sharp screech of tires sounded from the far end of the parking lot, followed by the lights of several cars rushing in. They were Rhodes's people, who had been quietly protecting her from a distance under his orders, and had moved in at once when they saw something wrong. Seeing that they had no chance left, the two men hurriedly withdrew into the darkness, leaving Maeve standing beneath the store lights, gasping for breath, her whole body trembling from shock but still unharmed and safe. And in that moment, she realized two things at once: that she had just escaped a real danger through her own courage and quick mind, and that even though she had tried to step away from Rhodes's world, the truth was that he had still been silently watching over her and protecting her, even after she had told him no. Rhodes's people quickly brought the situation under control and took Maeve somewhere safe. But this time, Rhodes had decided not to handle things in the old underworld way he had once known, because he understood that if he truly wanted to step out of the darkness, he had to let the light of the law do its work. Over the past several weeks, he had quietly gathered every piece of evidence about the rival gang's operations, from the sabotage at the harbor to their illegal transactions, and the intimidation of Maeve had been fully captured by the security camera at the place she had so wisely run toward. And he handed that entire file to a police inspector he trusted, opening the way for a large-scale investigation. Maeve's courage and quick thinking on the night she was threatened, the way she knew to buy time and run toward the camera and the light, became a crucial link that gave the police the evidence they needed to trace the whole network, and this only deepened Rhodes's admiration for the woman who had seemed so fragile on the outside. As the rival gang's network was gradually stripped apart, the dark cords Desmond had entangled himself in began tightening around his own neck, because when the police swept through the loan sharking operation and uncovered his role as an errand man who supplied information, there was nowhere left for him to hide. Worse still, the very creditors in the gang, seeing their structure collapse and suspecting someone inside had leaked information, turned on Desmond himself to cut off the loose end, leaving the once boastful man living in absolute terror, trapped between the law on one side and the ruthless people he had foolishly joined hands with on the other. In the end, Desmond was arrested by the police on a gray morning, not because anyone had taken revenge on him, but simply because his own shady actions had led him to that conclusion. The illegal loans, his assistance to crime, and even his secret theft of Maeve's property, which was now also exposed under the light of the investigation. When news of Desmond's downfall spread, Corinne, the mistress who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him during the days when he still appeared glamorous, immediately turned her back on him and vanished without a word of farewell, taking whatever she could still salvage and abandoning him at the very moment he most needed someone to lean on, leaving him alone to face the consequences of his own choices. Maeve heard the news of the downfall of the two people who had once pushed her to the bottom, and no satisfaction or hatred rose inside her, only a faint sadness and a quiet understanding that what people sow, they eventually reap, that those who live only by lies and greed will one day be swallowed by those very lies and that very greed. She realized that true consequence did not need anyone's hand of revenge, because every cruel choice Desmond and Corinne had made was like a brick they themselves had laid on the road leading to their own abyss, and she did not need to do anything else except keep walking toward her own light. Standing beside Rhodes and looking back on everything that had happened, Maeve understood that the darkest chapter of her life had now truly closed, not through destruction or hatred, but through justice, and through the very dignity she had stubbornly preserved through so many storms, and for the first time, she felt she could look forward without being pulled back by the shadows of the past. As for Rhodes, when he saw the law settle every debt and grievance for him, without the need for a single drop of blood in the old way, he became even more certain of the new path he had chosen, the path of leaving darkness behind and moving toward a life where he could stand with his head held high, beside the woman who had taught him that true strength did not lie in power or fear, but in kindness and integrity. That winter passed, and when the first flecks of spring sunlight returned to warm the city, the lives of both Maeve and Rhodes turned to an entirely new page, because the man whose name had once made the entire city speak in cautious whispers had now step by step fulfilled his promise, leaving the underworld behind and turning his entire empire toward a lawful and transparent path, transforming Callahan Freight into an honest company that created work for hundreds of people. But what moved Maeve most was not that change itself, but the fact that Rhodes used his own wealth and influence to establish a charitable foundation for orphans and disadvantaged children in the region, as a quiet way of atoning for the mistakes of his past and giving something back to life, because he said that it was Maeve, once an orphan child who had grown up in hardship, who had taught him what true kindness meant. As for Maeve, she finally reached the dream she had thought was dead. She returned to school through her own hands and willpower, completed the nursing degree she had left unfinished, and became a nurse in the pediatric ward of the city hospital, where every day she wore the white coat she had once dreamed of and cared for children with all the gentleness and devotion of someone who understood deeply what pain meant. She also officially completed the adoption process for little Felix, giving the boy who had endured so much hardship a real home and a whole mother, until his laughter ringing through the warm house became the most beautiful sound, healing the old wounds in her heart. Maeve and Rhodes came together not because of the debt from that fateful rainy night, and not because of money or power, but because both of them had seen the truth of each other beneath the layers life had placed over them. A woman who seemed fragile yet carried extraordinary strength within her, and a man who seemed cold and ruthless yet still had a heart capable of turning toward goodness. Standing in the sunlit house, watching Felix run and play while the man she loved smiled beside her, Maeve quietly told herself that she had once believed a person's value was decided by others, had once allowed rejection and betrayal to convince her that she was not worthy of being loved. But now she understood that each person's worth lay in the way they chose to live and the way they chose to treat others, that even the smallest flame of kindness had enough power to light up a long, dark winter if we never let it go out. Maeve and Rhodes's story leaves us with profound lessons about life, that self-respect is the most precious possession no one can steal unless we willingly trade it away, that kindness, given without condition, will one day return to warm us when we least expect it, that no one, no matter how far they may have strayed, is incapable of changing if they have enough courage to choose the right path again, and that a person's true strength does not lie in what they own, but in the dignity and resilience they preserve through every storm. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel, like and share this video so we can spread meaningful messages together and welcome many new captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Maeve and Rhodes's story? What moved you most? And what do you think truly changed their lives? Please leave a comment below, because we always hope to hear the sincere feelings from deep within your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story in full. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, serenity, and peace every day. Goodbye, and I hope to see you again in our next video.